Padre Jonathan, they're digging up my grandmother. 8-year-old Maria Santos burst into Reverend Jonathan Cross's morning prayers with dirt on her small hands and tears streaming down her Apache face. It was October 12, 1877, in the high desert country of New Mexico Territory, and what this terrified little girl was about to tell Jonathan would force him to make an impossible choice between his Christian mission and protecting the most sacred ground her people had ever known. "Slow down, child," Jonathan said gently, kneeling to Maria's level in the simple adobe chapel he'd built 6 months earlier. The 8-year-old had become like a daughter to him since her parents had died in the scarlet fever outbreak that winter. She was one of only 12 Apache children whose families trusted the white preacher enough to let them attend his mission school. But what Maria was about to reveal would test that fragile trust in ways Jonathan never imagined. Maria's words came out in a rush of Apache, Spanish, and broken English, the 3 languages she'd learned to navigate between her traditional world and the one Jonathan represented. "The yellow hair men with the big machines," she gasped, pointing toward the sacred mountains. "They're at the grandmother stones, where my people sleep forever. They're making deep holes in the sacred earth." Jonathan's blood ran cold. He knew exactly what Maria meant. 3 miles north of his mission lay an ancient Apache burial ground that the Mescalero people considered the most holy place in their territory. For over 300 years, their ancestors had been laid to rest there among the red sandstone formations they called the Grandmother Stones. What Maria had discovered would either unite 2 faiths or destroy everything Jonathan had worked to build. The burial ground wasn't just any piece of land, it was where Maria's own grandmother, the beloved medicine woman Ayana, had been buried just 2 months ago. Jonathan had been there for the ceremony, one of the few white men ever allowed to witness the sacred Apache burial rituals. He had watched as Maria placed her grandmother's favorite turquoise bracelet in the grave, whispering Apache prayers that somehow didn't sound so different from his own Christian hymns. "Show me," Jonathan said, reaching for his hat. But as they stepped outside the chapel, he could already hear the distant sound that would haunt his dreams for years to come. The mechanical grinding of steam-powered mining equipment echoing across the desert like some unholy thunder. The Copper Mountain Mining Company had finally arrived to begin their excavation, and they clearly didn't care whose ancestors lay buried in their path to gold. Maria grabbed Jonathan's weathered hand with her small fingers, and together they climbed the rocky trail that led toward the sacred site. With each step, the sounds grew louder, not just the machines, but angry Apache voices rising in anguished protest. When they crested the final ridge, Jonathan saw a scene that would change the course of his ministry forever. Below them, 5 massive steam shovels were systematically destroying what had been a peaceful valley of ancient burial mounds. White workers in dusty clothes directed the machines while a dozen Apache men and women stood helplessly behind a line of armed guards, watching their ancestors' graves being torn open like wounds in the earth. But what made Jonathan's heart stop was the sight of a small skeleton, clearly that of a child, lying exposed in one of the excavated trenches. "That's my cousin Little Eagle," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible over the machinery. "He died when I was 5. My grandmother sang him to sleep in the earth with the old songs." Tears began flowing freely down her cheeks as she watched the sacred bones being carelessly shoveled aside like debris. "Padre Jonathan, why doesn't your God protect our grandmother stones too?" The question hit Jonathan like a physical blow. In 6 months of ministry among the Apache people, he had come to believe that his Christian God and their Great Spirit were perhaps different names for the same divine presence. He had seen miraculous healing in their ceremonies, witnessed love and compassion that rivaled anything in his own church, and learned that Apache prayers often echoed the same pleas for guidance and protection that filled his own sermons. But now, faced with this systematic desecration, Jonathan found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about his calling. How could he preach about a loving God while watching these gentle people's most sacred space being destroyed for gold? How could he ask the Apache to trust in Christian mercy when Christians were the ones wielding the shovels that violated their ancestors' rest? "We have to stop them," Maria said with the fierce determination that only an 8-year-old can muster. You have to make them understand that the grandmother stones are sacred too. She looked up at Jonathan with absolute faith in his ability to fix this catastrophe. The same look she'd given him when he'd comforted her after her parents' deaths. But this time, Jonathan wasn't sure if his prayers would be enough. The mining foreman, a burly man named Cletus Morrison who wore his prejudice as openly as his leather work gloves, spotted Jonathan approaching and strode over with obvious irritation. "Reverend, you need to keep your Apache friends away from our worksite. We got a legitimate claim here, filed proper with the Territorial Office. This land belongs to the Copper Mountain Mining Company now." "Mr. Morrison," Jonathan replied, his voice carefully controlled despite the rage building in his chest. "This is a burial ground. These people have been laying their dead to rest here for centuries. Surely there must be some way to respect both your business interests and their religious rights." But even as he spoke, Jonathan could see the dismissive look in Morrison's eyes that told him this conversation was futile. "Religion," Morrison spat into the dust. "Reverend, these ain't Christian graves. These are just Indian bones, and they got no legal standing in a court of law. You want to help these people, you teach 'em to bury their dead in proper cemeteries like civilized folks." He gestured toward the excavation where workers were now carefully extracting chunks of gold-bearing quartz from the disturbed earth. "This strike could make every man here rich. Don't expect us to stop for a bunch of old bones." Behind them, the Apache mourners had begun a low chanting that seemed to make the very air vibrate with grief and power. Jonathan recognized the voice of Nalnish, the current medicine man who had reluctantly accepted the young preacher's presence in their community. The old man's chant was a plea to the spirits of the dead to forgive this violation, but Jonathan could hear something else in the ancient words, a growing anger that could easily turn to violence.